Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding, and you are once again listening to PreserveCast. Today, we have a really fascinating conversation lined up for us. But before we get there, I just want to remind people it's really helpful if you rate, review, and subscribe to PreserveCast. So whatever platform you're listening on, please do that. It actually helps quite a bit. And make sure that if you're on social media and you've enjoyed an episode, jump on there and share the episode with your friends. It's a way of getting the word out about this podcast, and we would really appreciate it. So, again, today we have a really interesting conversation and sort of about, one of these tasks of making history new again and exciting for different audiences. And we're going to be talking today with 2 individuals from the Johns Hopkins University system. And we're going to be talking about the museums on this campus, on the sprawling university campus. Today, we're going to be speaking with Lori Beth Finkelstein, who is the Philip Franklin Wagley Director and Curator of Johns Hopkins University's Evergreen Museum and Library and Director of Homewood Museum. And we're also going to be speaking with Michelle Fitzgerald, who is the Curator of Collections at Johns Hopkins University Museums. And we're going to be talking about what they preserve and interpret, and as well as a specific sort of story about a new exhibit that's open that you can go and visit through the next couple of years, If Homewood's Walls Could Talk, A History of an American House. But before we get there, we love to get to know the people that we're talking with. So maybe we'll start with Lori first. And I apologize, Lori, if I don't say your full title again for the rest of the episode. But it's a bit of a mouthful. We got it all in there, though. But we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. So where did you grow up and what got you passionate about history and preservation? And then we'll head over to Michelle. But I know you've had a really cool career. So let's talk a little bit about what put you on the path to that.
Thanks. I grew up in Montreal, Canada, and went to McGill University and then pursued graduate education in New York. And having studied and lived in several historic places, I really always felt like I understood history best by having those in-person experiences with historic sites and historic objects. So pursued a master's degree in public history and a PhD in U.S. history, but have always worked on the historic preservation and historic interpretation side of things.
And how did you find your way across the border?
Yeah, so I went to NYU to pursue a master's degree in public history, and I stayed on to do a PhD in U.S. history there. And that was really the result of a course that I had the great pleasure to take as an undergraduate, where the professor had us go into public spaces in Montreal and study public statues, public gardens, public grounds, and use those pieces of the built environment, the historic built environment, to understand the history of Montreal better. And now I think that that's more common in undergraduate education, but in the early 1990s, that was pretty innovative. And none of us who took this professor's course had ever done anything like that. Some of us were from Montreal, some of us were from other cities, and we were all history majors, and none of us had really thought of studying history just physically standing in historic spaces. We'd always done it through reading books and articles and print primary sources. And I think for a lot of us, this was pretty eye-opening. And for me, it led me to want to pursue a graduate education that made that type of exploration the focus of the work that one got to do. And so inspired by that class, I looked at different public history programs in both the United States and in Canada, and ended up at the public history program at NYU.
Very cool. And today you're at the Johns Hopkins University system, but you've had some interesting stops along the way before there. Do you want to just share some of the cool places that you've been a part of preserving and interpreting?
Sure. So, yes, I've definitely had some cool stops along the way. I've had several museum jobs. I worked at a museum called the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts in Madison, New Jersey. This was a museum that was headquartered in an 1899 Richardsonian Romanesque town library that got vacated by the town of Madison, New Jersey in the 1970s when they built a modern new library in this amazing building, the intersection, the two main streets in the town, became home to the collection of a family, a private collection of early tools that they had acquired and that they exhibited in two salt box houses that they lived in down the street from the library. They would invite school children to come and see their amazing collection of early New Jersey tools. And when the museum moved, when the library moved, that town, the building became the home of that museum in town. And so I worked there for a number of years. I worked at a small historic house museum in New York City. Then I worked for 8 years at the Maryland Zoo, with a stint actually at the Baltimore Museum of Industry in there as well. And you'd think, zoo, why would a historian go work at a zoo? Well, Maryland Zoo is the third oldest zoo in the United States, and it is in the middle of amazing, fascinating, historic Druid Hill Park. And so, while we were a zoo and open to the public, as a zoo, there was actually quite a lot of interesting history work to be done as well. And there was opportunities there to research the historic buildings on that campus and the zoo's long history as a site visited by families in Baltimore. So
yeah, and I think that may have been where we met first. And I you don't know this, but I always thought that might have been the coolest historian job I'd ever come across, because as a little kid I wanted to be a zookeeper, and I was like, oh my god, it's something, my two dreams came together in one position. So very cool place.
Thanks. I actually was the self-declared zoo historian. I don't know if anyone else recognized me in that role, but I certainly recognized myself in that role.
Yeah.
And did a lot of work with the historical photo archives that the zoo has. And we actually partnered with students at UMBC in the public history program there for a signage exhibit, doing a then and now of several exhibits around the campus. So for a separate preservation cast, you can ask me many questions about the history of Maryland Zoo, and I'm happy to share that.
Yeah, that would be very cool. And I've seen that exhibit because you sort of have to walk through it to get into the zoo, and it's pretty cool. So, Michelle, where did you grow up, and what put you on the path to being the curator?
Yeah, so I grew up in Columbia, Maryland, so not too far from Baltimore. And I came to the field maybe sort of late, maybe sort of early, depends on your perspective. But I majored in theater, was graduating from undergrad, applied to something like 16 theater internships and one history internship right before the deadline, and ended up choosing the history internship because it paid. The job was at the Maryland State Archives, working for the Maryland Commission on Artistic Property, specifically on the Maryland State House's old Senate chamber restoration. And I remember being about a week into this internship and working with all these historic documents, working on this site, and learning that these objects really have a lot of stories to tell that were in the collection. And I remember just having this moment at the desk, like, oh, okay, this is what I want to do. This is it. And I ended up staying there for 2 years and had wonderful mentorship experience there that really set me on the track for material culture.
And what were you going to do if you were going to stay in theater?
Great question.
Were you going to perform, or were you going to were you doing performance, or were you doing?
Yeah, I did performance. I was usually cast in the sad girl Victorian drama roles. So that's my
Yeah.
alternate life.
Yeah, which can
I
come
still
in handy for a historic house museum, right? Like
Yes.
there's some interesting overlap there. And I also do think that people like we work with a lot of people who have some theater background or they did it in high school or something like that. And not only does it create some confidence, but it's also having sort of a sense of the dramatic can be really helpful, I think, for not only for just work and storytelling, but also like getting ideas across to people and how you have to present things. And then also sort of like the set dressing of things that like not every exhibit has to be perfect exactly behind the scenes as long as it looks good. So there's some really interesting overlaps. So I have to do a theater conversation at some point.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I strongly believe in our humanities majors of like, you can use these skills pretty creatively. And I've definitely used my theater degree quite a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Lori, I mean, I guess one of the questions that people might have listening to this conversation is like, well, I thought Johns Hopkins was like a Division I research school. Like they're out figuring out the future of AI and supercomputing and things I can't even pronounce. Like what Johns Hopkins has museums. Why does Johns Hopkins have museums? And how many do you care for?
Why do we have museums, and why do we have historic house museums, which is quite unusual for universities? We have 3 museums at the university. 2 fall under the Division of Libraries, Museums, and Archives, and those are the 2 museums that I oversee. And then we have a 3rd museum, which is an archaeology museum, and that is part of the Krieger School of Arts and Science. And we have opportunities to collaborate with our wonderful colleagues there, but it does fall under a different division. We have 2 museums that came to the university in an unrelated fashion. So one museum, the Homewood Museum, which is going to be the focus, I think, of some conversation that we're going to have in a little bit regarding the exhibit that's there now, was on the campus that became the university's Homewood campus before Johns Hopkins University was here, before Johns Hopkins University existed. So Homewood House was built between 1801 and 1804 for the son of Charles Carroll, signer of the Declaration of Independence. And his son lived here with his wife and family and upwards of 25 people whom he enslaved on this property for a couple of decades. And then the house had several lives after that, which is really what the exhibit that Michelle curated is about. And then in 1902, the owner of the house and the property on which it sat at the time, Samuel Wyman, willed that property or gifted it, I guess, to the university. And in 1914, when the campus opened, this building was one of the structures on the campus. Johns Hopkins University was founded in 1876, and it was originally in downtown Baltimore. But by the early 20th century, there was a desire for it to have more of a campus and less of an urban presence. And this land, thanks to the gift from Samuel Wyman, became available. Early plans for the university worked to incorporate Homewood House into the overall campus design. And so there's great sketches that we have in our archives featuring Homewood quite prominently. And if you walk through the campus, you'll see that the architecture of a lot of the campus is reflective of that federal architecture of Homewood Museum. But then there's another historic house. It's Evergreen, and it's not on the campus. It's on Charles Street between Loyola and Notre Dame. And that house was donated to Johns Hopkins University in 1942 by John Work Garrett, who was a supporter of the university and a trustee of the university. And he donated the house, the grounds, and his collections of rare books and objects that he collected to Johns Hopkins University, with the caveat that his wife could live there for the duration of her life if he predeceased her. And he does. He dies in 1942, and his wife stays in Evergreen until 1952. And when she passes, the house comes to the university. So they don't really relate to each other as museums in terms of how they came to the university, but there actually are a lot of connections between them. And some of those connections come up in this exhibit a little bit. The people who are involved in both houses as donors and supporters are part of the same group of elite Baltimoreans who care about arts and culture in this city. And there are unexpected, or actually they're not that unexpected. There are connections that emerge when you dig into the history of both sites. Though Evergreen, architecturally very different from Homewood. The original core of the house is built in 1858 for a family named the Broadbent family. And then the Garrett family purchases the house in 1878, and they move in the early 1880s, and they make many additions to the structure.
Yeah, Evergreen is, I mean, I've been to a lot of house museums. It's a wild place. I mean, I don't, that's not going to be the quote you use on the website, but it is sprawling and confusing, and it's Victorian and arts and crafts, and it's got so much cool stuff going on in it. It's definitely worth a visit. And as you mentioned too, I mean, sort of a national connection here as well. As there were many, but the Garretts, of course, are the family that bring us, in some ways, the B&O Railroad. And so that's like this watershed moment, not only in Maryland history, but in American history, is the development of the railroad. And so a lot of that wealth, of course, is tied back into all of that. And just a cool site because of that and what they were able to collect at that time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
So the most obvious connection is when the Carroll family built Homewood on what becomes the Johns Hopkins University campus. Charles Street is not yet a thoroughfare that heads all the way north past Homewood. That house is really in the country at the time. And by the time the Wyman family acquired the property in the 1830s, Michelle, 1840s, correct me if I'm wrong. 1830s. They, within a decade or so, realized, like, as Charles Street gets developed in the 1850s, they don't want to be on this main street. And they built a separate mansion house for themselves on the sort of Wyman Park side of the campus. And the newsletter office on the Homewood campus is the original gatehouse to that mansion house called Wyman Villa, which no longer exists. And then Homewood has all these other lives. Interestingly enough, the Broadbent family chooses to have a house much more on Charles Street as a result of Charles Street opening up. So these houses are both really impacted by the growth of the city. And by the 1850s, there are now these, at the time, what were referred to as suburban mansions dotting Charles Street, continuing to head north outside of the city, what is now the city limits and was then, still the county. So, you can take these houses as sort of bookends for the history of Charles Street and also for the history of suburban expansion in what was then suburban Baltimore, that's now Baltimore City's northernmost parts.
Yeah, I mean, they tell some fascinating stories, but obviously, like a lot of house museums, it can be hard to bring that story to life, right? Like there's, the very traditional house museum experience as you go around and you look at the chairs and all those sorts of things. And so I know that you guys are really dedicated to trying to bring a lot of this story sort of to the forefront and to life and explain these connections. And I presume, although I don't know, if that's what kind of brought about the desire to put this exhibit together. So the exhibit is called If Homewood's Walls Could Talk, A History of an American House. And I thought maybe Michelle could kind of give us an idea of like, where did the impetus for this come from? What kind of an exhibit is it? And how is it different from what has come before?
Yeah, sure. So Homewood was always between these two museums. The museum, at least since I've been at Hopkins, which has been since 2018, that was the museum that we were going to focus attention on for the 250th anniversary that's coming up. Because of its connection to Charles Carroll of Carrollton, because of its location on campus, that house just makes a lot of sense for telling that story. So we knew in 2026 we wanted to do an exhibit at Homewood. And then we also have this other anniversary at Hopkins happening at the same time, which is the 150th of the university in 2026. So we now had two anniversaries we wanted to put into one exhibition. We also wanted an exhibition that could stay up for the full length of 2026. So one that could endure, that people could still come if they wanted to see the general tour and not be impeded to do that. And we wanted to have as many students as possible involved. And so that's a lot of different sort of criteria to corral. And at the same time, we, Lori and I and Jeanette Markson, our programming manager, have spent a lot of time thinking about Homewood and what this house means to students today, to visitors, what they care about with this house, and what it means to them. So the way we sort of corralled everything into this exhibition is I thought it might be easiest to turn it over to the house and let the house be the main character and tell its own story. And that's really where this idea came about, is if we let the house have every room in the house tell a different period of Homewood's past, we're telling both the story of Homewood and American history, as well as Homewood and Hopkins history. And so it's really centered around a microhistory of the house to tell this bigger social and educational story. We did have a lot of, different people that we wanted involved in this exhibit. So I also contained it to 3 themes that really appear throughout the house in all its different incarnations, which is education. And then we also have stories of power in this house, and then stories of resistance that come up in every era as well. And so by telling all these different individual voices and stories that we highlight throughout the house, using very specific key objects, key architectural features of the house, and specific primary source material, we try and give the visitor the idea of that a historic house isn't just the one period in time that it's interpreted to. It's actually a culmination of different layers of different periods over time that make it what it is today and what we love.
Yeah, I think that that's so interesting that we're finally to this place in sort of historic house museum administration that the layered history approach is definitely one that not only do administrators sort of embrace it, but I think the public is beginning to embrace it as well. Like, they're fascinated by this idea that these houses have evolved, and that one snapshot of that one period has never really been a real thing, right? That was sort of a creation because it's had that whole long life, right? And even its time as a museum is a part of now its story. It's been that so long. I'm curious, the experience that people would get if they came here, and obviously this is not just a Maryland story, but a lot of people come and visit the Hopkins campus, so this is an opportunity for a lot of different people to come and see this museum and see this exhibit. What kind of an exhibit approach did you take in terms of what you'll see when you go through it? Is it panels? Is it hands-on? Is it audio-visual? What kind of experience? And then maybe Lori and you can talk a little bit about some characters that pop up in these different themes.
Sure. Yeah. So we knew we wanted the exhibit to be self-guided. And as I mentioned, each room sort of covers a different period of the house. It's not, and this is kind of important, it's not fully refurnished to that period because, again, going back to the layers, I wanted the original, this 1887 restoration of the house to be present and a thread throughout. So we haven't changed any of the furniture in the period rooms or anything like that. We've added in each room panels, a small selection of key objects from that period, and audio component where you can scan and you hear either when we have oral histories, a voice of a person who has experienced something at Homewood from that time. And in the period where we don't have oral histories, we've hired Hopkins theater students to read primary source material from the actual words of the people at that time period. I intentionally haven't organized the rooms in any sort of chronological order. That's part of the self-guided experience, is, again, if we're telling this story, if we're letting the house tell its story, I know that when I'm telling my own story and my own past, I'm not necessarily telling it in chronological order or remembering it in that. And we wanted that sense of memory and that disjointed timeline in some ways to come across and let people experience and discover the different time periods on their own. So the concept of discovery is a really important one, I think, for this exhibition. But you do, to answer that part of your question, you get panels, you get objects, you get audio. There's a little bit of each in each room.
Yeah. And I like that idea of not having the flow, because is there anything more disappointing when you're in a museum when you realize you're going against the flow? And then you're like, wait a second, how did I? And then you have to figure out where you are in the story, and you got to move back. Or
me at every museum. Yes.
Yeah. Particularly if you're lucky enough to be in Europe, and then you're like, oh my gosh, I'm trying to read in German, and I have somehow ended up in the wrong period of German history.
Right.
Yeah. Good luck. Lori, I'm curious, we're going to maybe kind of bounce back and forth between you two just to kind of give people a flavor for some of these different stories. But like the education piece, I mean, obviously that's central to the Hopkins story, central to the work that you do in interpreting and preserving these places and making them sort of come alive for the Hopkins campus. You have a lot of source material to draw from for education in particular. So do you have any favorites or any individuals that jump out that you think are a fascinating piece of the exhibit?
Sure. So they don't pertain to the history of the university in terms of teaching and academia, but there are several fascinating characters who I had the opportunity to learn about through research that my students did for this exhibit. So as Michelle mentioned, having students engaged in this exhibition was really important to us. And I taught a class last fall on the colonial revival and how that figured in to what happened in this house in the 1920s and 1930s. And we wanted to highlight the fact that the exhibition that opened up in Homewood Museum in the 1980s, which is really what you see when you come to the museum today, was not the first attempt at a museum at Homewood. There were actually two previous attempts at museums at Homewood, and one happened in 1928. And it was mounted by a group called the Friends of Art, which were active in arts installations throughout the city. And lo and behold, who was the honorary president of the Friends of Art in 1928? Why, it was Alice Garrett of Evergreen. And so back to that idea of there being these connections. And so this group of sort of elite white men and women wanted, in this moment of the 1920s when Baltimore, like cities across America, are seeing a rise of immigration and industrialization and urbanization, wanted to use Homewood as an opportunity to lean into some really feelings of nostalgia, if you will, about a colonial past. Okay, so Homewood, not technically a colonial house, right? It's built after the American Revolution, but it has this colonial connection because its construction was financed by Charles Carroll, only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he stays here, and it is, sort of high federal style architecture. So these Friends of Art do these period installations in rooms throughout the house, including with fresh flowers, which of course, we don't do anymore for fear of the furniture. They have their friends loan them these great examples of really fine period furniture, early American furniture, and they do these vignettes throughout the house. And so my students had the opportunity to find the photographs that were taken of the house at the time and to research the people involved and to pick objects from our collection today that they could use to talk about this 1928 installation and why they think it took place and who the Friends of Art thought would come and see it. It's covered widely in the Baltimore Sun. You can learn all about that 1928 installation when you come to the museum. And then the other interesting character, which I'll speak about quickly, is a man named Francis Garvin. He is a well-known decorative arts collector in the 1930s and 40s. His collection of decorative arts became the cornerstone of the Yale collection of decorative arts. But in 1932, he opens an installation at Homewood House featuring his collection. And the core of our collection today, not the core, I say the earliest part of our collection today is probably a better way to phrase it, is the result of gifts that he made to the university of objects that he exhibited here. And my students found him interesting to study because he was Catholic. And he really gravitated to Homewood because of its connection to Catholicism. And he wanted to remind people, I think, that Catholics were people who were part of the early founding of this country and who were obviously integral to the founding of Maryland. And so even though he wasn't a Marylander, he was very much drawn to this house because of that Catholic history. So I think the sort of, you take these stories together and then you connect it back to what Michelle was saying about the exhibit as a whole. Homewood becomes this touch point for different groups of people with different interests over time, because I think of the long history of this house and the way it sort of has had these different lives, if you will.
Yeah, and I like that because it's interesting. I think it kind of shows to the visitor that like history and preservation and all of these and exhibits and art are as much about the people putting the exhibits together as they are about whatever the history it is that they're trying to tell. And I think sometimes people don't always recognize that. I also love the name Friends of Art. I think that we need to put that back together. That's pretty cool. Michelle, it's interesting that this idea of power and resistance. I guess in one way you could kind of look at it as like two sides of the same coin, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's some people who are in power and some people resist them. And that is just sort of this perpetual, motion that happens. How did you choose to kind of tell those stories and who were sort of standouts in those stories and what spaces did you use for them?
Yeah. So, I'm gonna focus on one room in particular to sort of answer all those questions in one, and that's Homewood's best bedchamber. If you're going through the house just on a normal tour, you will notice that room, a bedroom, which today we might think of as a more private space, then would still be a space that you'd be receiving visitors in the early 19th century, and it represents itself that way. It's quite a fancy space. It has very tall ceilings, has this big central medallion in it. And you can tell from the architecture, it's telling you that this is an important room. And so when we fast forward to the 20th century, when Hopkins has moved in to campus, they use Homewood as the administration building. And the best bedchamber becomes the president's office for Homewood. And so you have this legacy of power that ends up right there. At the president's office, in response to the fact that Homewood's now the administration building and the president's office. You also see in the 60s and 70s stories of student organized movements and protests happening right outside of Homewood, right on the steps. And there are these very moving pieces of multimedia that survive from that. But we have a couple of objects in that room in particular, and a couple of stories that have really spoken to me personally, and I think our students in particular, it really resonates with. One of my favorite people to talk about is John Guess, who was a student in the 60s at Hopkins. And in 1967, he founded the Black Student Organization at the time, now the Black Student Union, and had spent quite a bit of time attempting to get Hopkins to recognize the BSO as a student group. And eventually it comes to a point where John Guest walks through the doors of Homewood and delivers this archival document that I think is known as the 10 Demands, that is calling for racial equality on campus. And it's this nice touch point in the racial history, I think, of Hopkins in the 20th century, and this really really beautiful moment for the house too, which is you can really feel stories of enslavement in this house's history, and you feel a lot of that tension still today, I think, when you walk through the house, and that's a really important part of the story. But then you also have this really monumental moment in the 20th century, I think, where you're seeing a really beautiful act of resistance there. That's in response to the fact that we have the president's office here in the space. And a nice legacy to John as well is he's on the Hopkins Museum Advisory Board, and he actually sponsored an internship for this exhibit. So we had a student who worked with me on the curation of this room in particular, and got to meet John and talk to John about his time. And I think that was a really significant moment for that student's research as well as their career path. And so you see sort of these legacies continuing forward into the present, and you see how Homewood's past isn't really that far. There's another story in that room with, I have to say, maybe one of my favorite objects. My favorite objects change all the time for this exhibit. But we have a skirt that was worn by Mindy Farber when she was a student in the early 70s at Hopkins. That's also displayed in this room. She was part of the first class of women at Hopkins. And this skirt is this really nice sort of velvet patchwork, colorful. It's very evocative of the 70s. Students today really seem to find it to be a really nice piece of clothing that they see and they want. But there's something about it that when you see it in that space, and you can visualize a student and a person, and you can visualize what this experience might have been like for Mindy and what you would have to go through as part of the first class of undergraduate women on a campus in the early 70s. And I think there's something about that object in particular that creates a really nice empathetic connection to moments of also quiet resistance, of when just your presence in a space is an act of resistance in some ways.
Yeah, well, a great answer. I mean, that's pretty cool to kind of hear about all that. And I think clothing and food, music, things like that really always seem to resonate with people. I think because it's like something we all have and do. Not all of us sign constitutions, on a regular basis,
Right.
but or rarely. But we all put on pants or a skirt, and so there's something it kind of humanizes that. And I think one of the reasons, and just sort of to put a cap on some of this, is that like we wanted to talk with you guys is, we hear about a lot of different museum exhibits and things like that happening around the country. And it's not just that you happen to be in the backyard of where PreserveCast is based, but I think that there's some really great examples in this exhibit in particular of how to engage students in the work that I think other museums around the country and practitioners of this work who listen to PreserveCast can maybe draw some ideas and examples from. But I also just love this layered history approach, and particularly as we approach the 250th, having I think one thing that the American Association of State and Local History, I was going to say AASLH, one thing that they point out is that the general public generally really is interested in layered history. They like to kind of see that. And I think sometimes we worry that, this will be too complex. Was there any worry like that, Michelle, that like, this is going to be too many different stories, we're going to lose people in this? Or did you try and have to kind of narrow it down to a couple key pieces within those themes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I was never worried about visitors feeling that the layered history would be too complex, because we know from just when Lori does a tour, when I do a tour, anecdotally, that our visitors are extremely engaged with the story of Homewood and its full history as a house. And if we don't bring it up, they're going to ask questions about it. And so this was information we knew our visitors were already looking for, and our students for that matter. I would say my primary concern was really when you have a lot of student curators, they all have their own voices in it, and finding that consistent voice overall that unites the exhibit together was something I was worried about. I didn't need to. These are Hopkins students. They know what they're doing, and they created beautiful labels, and it did not require a lot to create one fluid voice through this exhibit. But I would say when you're working with a lot of students, that's always my fear, is that things could stick out instead of blend together into one voice.
Yeah. Lori, I mean, I think, as we kind of come to a little bit of a conclusion here, obviously you worked with Michelle to plan this not only for the 250th anniversary of the nation, which is sort of the seminal moment in public history thought, but also it's the 150th anniversary of Hopkins. So there's all these, once again, layers and layers of anniversaries and things like that. I'm curious what you think, someone having had a really long and interesting career in public history, in museums, you've seen different anniversaries. What's a best case scenario for the public history field through the 250th? What are you hoping to see happen? And what are you optimistic about for the Hopkins campus with all of these different anniversaries? Is this a moment for history to shine, and how do you kind of think about that over the next year?
Well, to go back to the point that was made earlier about people really being interested in recent history, I think what we're able to achieve with this exhibit is reminding people that that something that might seem being very far distant in the past is actually relevant today. The ideas that Homewood as a place of resistance and education is still relevant today. We work hard in the General House tour to elevate the stories of the people who were enslaved on site, who did not leave us written records of their experiences. And we try to make the people who were enslaved here as three-dimensional as the Carrolls, for whom we do have written evidence of their lives. And that's something that is going to continue to be a part of the story of this house. And even if you come on the tour now, you can scan, as Michelle was saying, a QR code to listen to the special exhibit tour, but you can also scan a QR code and hear the general history tour of the house. And we want to make sure that we're continuing to talk about the earliest things that happened here and the difficult history that is a part of this structure, and make it part of an ongoing story of the campus as places where students into the 20th century struggled for civil rights at Homewood, who fought to be included as women students at Homewood. And I think also architecturally, this structure is relevant to how the entire campus looks. And when students walk through campus, for me at least, it's important to me that they understand why their campus looks the way it does. That campus design is not accidental, it's very intentional. And many decisions have been made over time here on the Homewood campus, going back to the early 20th century, for how to design a space that's meant to engage students in learning. And those ideas have changed over time. The earliest models of the campus were meant for the campus to be very inward looking. So the backs of the buildings are what faced Charles Street. Now, if you look at the new student center that opened, that's very intentionally public facing. The front door of that building is right on Charles Street. So why did that change happen? And how does that change reflect how Hopkins sees its role in the city differently over time, and how Hopkins sees the needs of students changing over time? So I think, if you take Homewood Museum at one side of Charles Street and you take that new student center sort of on the other, what history lies between those two structures, and what has changed over time on this campus? And I'd like students to be cognizant of that, to be aware of where they fit in this timeline, in the timeline of this institution during their own 4 years here.
Yeah, I like that. I think this idea of just where you fit into the timeline is something that's replicable for a lot of different sites, a lot of different institutions, a lot of different organizations, to sort of think about the 250. I think that's an interesting way of doing it. Michelle, I'm curious, from your role as the curator here, what do you hope that this exhibit accomplishes, and what do you hope, additionally that the preservation and history community gets out of the 250th?
Yeah, that's a great question. For this exhibit, what I hope to accomplish with it is to really get our visitors, and especially our students, to see themselves as active contributors to history. When we're looking back at 250 years and this big anniversary we have coming up, I think there's this impulse to want to focus on the 18th century and this remarkable dramatic story of the American Revolution. But we're also very much so living in 2025, and we have our own history that's happened in between that time period that we're living in, that we're products of. And I think it's easy when you're a student in a large school or an individual in a city to not necessarily see that your life has these tangible impacts, and these historic properties hold those stories in them. Lori mentioned that we have these we have these historical silences at Homewood as well. And that's something that we try to highlight in our general tour. And it's something that we try to recognize in this exhibit too, that there's records that we have of we don't have someone's full story written out for us. But we have these small impacts that allow people to recognize these lives and to think about these lives and the impact that they had on history. And so I think for the 250th, those sort of case studies and those micro histories can be very impactful to people in the present, and create a lot more relatable individuals, I think, than some of these early figures that feel a little less accessible, I think, sometimes.
I
when
like
you're
that
thinking
a
about
lot.
George Washington.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Stuff.
Yeah, I like that a lot because I think that's encouragement for sites that are listening or people who work at these sites that are like, well, we don't have, George Washington, not only did he not live here, he didn't even stay here, and so what story are we going to tell? And I like this idea of microhistories and how impactful those really can be in capturing people's minds and, their imagination. Whether it be a skirt or, food or whatever it might be, there's lots of ways to kind of engage people in those stories. So before we go, this has been a fascinating conversation. I encourage everybody to get out there and see it. We will put a link in the show notes, of course, to the website so you can learn about, hours and visitation and all that good stuff. But before we go, we always ask people about their favorite historic places or sites or a place that they could always go back to. So we'll go with Lori and then we'll head over to Michelle.
Favorite site? I'm going to go with the Giraffe House at the Maryland Zoo. Mid-century modern spaceship that landed in the middle of Druid Hill Park, meant to house giraffe. It's changed inside over time. Early in its life, it actually housed, I believe, reptiles as well. And it's to me, this great example of trying to mold two purposes together. It's meant to evoke, I think, the sort of spirit of Africa a little bit. The original incarnation had these shields that were mounted on the exterior that were produced through an arts partnership with the federal government and African nations, I believe. I think they eventually were removed due to deterioration, but the building still sits. And, if you look back the early history of Druid Hill Park, it had a lot of pretty Victoriana looking structures in it. But by the 1960s, the park designers and zoo designers were leaning heavily into the contemporary architecture of their time. And in a way, they left us a gift to help us understand what they thought was attractive and useful in the 1960s.
Yeah, no, it is one of the grooviest buildings
That's the word, thank you. It is very groovy.
It is so groovy, and every time I go, I just can't stop but go and take pictures, and I'm just like, it's gorgeous. It's a really that's a great example. Good,
it has
call.
A really, really cool history.
Yeah, no, I love that. Michelle, what have you got?
I always have to go with the Dennis Sievers house in London. I'm obsessed with it, so I'll always mention it. But it's a 18th century house near Spitalfields Market, owned by a man in the 20th century named Dennis Sievers. I believe he was an American, has this fabulous life, was friends with Princess Margaret. And he creates, in the 70s in this house, he recreates sort of an artistic installation almost, / period house of what a Huguenot family in the 18th century in this house would have experienced. And you can go through the house today. They do these evening tours where they light candles everywhere. I think they have a cat that walks around. They have smells and food cooking. And no one speaks, and you just walk around the house and you experience the house. And I think it's just like textbook historic empathy. And, you're not necessarily walking away with 18th century facts, but you're walking away with 18th century feelings and that sort of that impact you can't put into words. And I think just taking a house that's your 18th century Huguenot silk weaver townhouse in London and creating this very romantic, almost magical experience is just like a beautiful textbook case of history.
Yeah, no, I that's great. That one has come up once before. I can't remember exactly who, but somebody brought that up once before as their favorite, and so we've got to get them on PreserveCast to talk to them. We've done some other British episodes, and we've covered some London history. We did the Charles Dickens house and talked about that historic site, but. Yeah, this one sounds fascinating. So that's a great example, and obviously there's some opportunities there to develop that sort of historical empathy, as you say, at sites across this country too. This has been a fascinating conversation. Just great to hear about the good work that's being done there at Johns Hopkins University. We've been talking, of course, with Lori Beth Finkelstein and Michelle Fitzgerald of Johns Hopkins University. You can find more information about this exhibit in the link in the show notes. And as always, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been fascinating.
Thanks.
PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland and is powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2017, the podcast has told stories from around the world about how people are documenting, caring for, and interpreting the past. If you want to support this effort, please visit preservecast.org to learn more and keep on preserving.